The Boeing 787 was already in motion. The safety briefing had wrapped up, the cabin lights softened to a low glow, and the wheels began their steady roll toward the runway. Yet inside the hushed cocoon of the first-class cabin, something far more explosive than takeoff was unfolding. A war had just begun. And no, it had nothing to do with legroom or how far a seat could recline. It centered on something far more audacious, a 19-year-old black man sitting in seat 2A and a wealthy executive in 2B who had decided, without hesitation, that he didn't belong there. Rosalind Fairmont believed she was doing a public service. In her mind, she was restoring order, keeping the neighborhood clean. What she didn't realize was that she was insulting the very person who unknowingly held the keys to her financial future. When the captain abruptly slammed the brakes on the tarmac and aborted the takeoff, passengers assumed there was a mechanical issue. They were wrong. What followed wasn't a technical delay, it was a moral reckoning. And for Rosalind, this flight would never reach London. Instead, her journey ended behind bars, in a jail cell, accompanied by a viral video and a level of public backlash so ruthless it would redefine the word karma. The air inside the first-class lounge at JFK International Airport was always meticulously regulated, cool, sterile, and fixed at precisely 68 degrees. But to Julian Crowhurst, it felt colder than usual. At just 19 years old, dressed in a charcoal hoodie that looked deliberately understated, Julian sat near the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing out at the tarmac. He watched quietly as the ground crew loaded luggage into the belly of the massive aircraft bound for London Heathrow. Adjusting the noise-canceling headphones resting around his neck, he wasn't thinking about turbulence or jet lag. Flying didn't make him nervo-rosalindus. The meeting waiting for him across the Atlantic did. His foot tapped lightly against the floor, keeping time with a habit he'd picked up during countless nights spent coding alone in his basement until the sun came up. "Excuse me?" The voice cut through the air-sharp, clipped and cold, like the snap of a blade. "You're blocking my view." Julian looked up. Towering over him stood a woman who seemed to radiate hostility, wrapped in luxury. She wore a cream-colored pantsuit that likely cost more than Julian's first car, and her blonde hair was pulled back into a bun so tight it strained the skin around her eyes. In her hand, she held a champagne flute, as though it were a weapon. This was Rosalind Fairmont, a senior vice president at Apex Global Logistics. For 30 years, she had clawed her way into the middle ranks of corporate power, and she deeply resented anyone who appeared to climb faster or easier than she had. "I'm sorry," Julian replied calmly, his voice polite, deep, and steady. "I said you're obstructing the view," Rosalind repeated, her eyes dragging over him with open scrutiny. She noticed the sneakers' rare, limited edition, though she had no idea they were his. The hoodie, plain and unassuming. What she didn't notice was the Patek Philippe watch partially hidden beneath his sleeve. What she did see was a black teenager occupying space she believed was reserved for people like her. "The staff break room is down the hall, past the elevators," she said flatly. "This area is for ticketed passengers." Julian blinked. The tone wasn't new to him. It was a familiar pitch of entitlement, the kind that usually ended with security being summoned. "I am a ticketed passenger, ma'am." Rosalind let out a short, brittle laugh, dry and hollow, like leaves crushed underfoot. "Don't insult my intelligence, boy. I'm a Diamond Medallion member. I know who belongs here." She leaned in slightly, her voice dripping with disdain. "If you're waiting for some celebrity boss or trying to sneak a free buffet, I suggest you leave now before I have you escorted out." Julian shifted in his leather chair. He could have ended the exchange instantly. He could have shown her his boarding pass first class, full fare. He could have clarified that he wasn't waiting for a boss. He was the boss. But experience had taught him something valuable. People like Rosalind didn't respond to facts. They only respected power. and at that moment all Julian wanted was to get to London. "I'm fine right where I am," he said simply. "Thanks." Then he turned his attention back to the window. Rosalind's face flushed a deep, dangerous red. Being ignored was not something she tolerated, especially not by someone she believed should be bagging her groceries. Without another word, she spun on her heel and marched toward the concierge desk. Julian watched her reflection ripple across the glass as she gestured aggressively at the desk agent, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger in his direction. He saw the agent, a composed woman named Lena, glance at her screen, then at Julian, and finally shake her head with firm certainty. Rosalind slammed her hand against the counter, snatched up her Louis Vuitton carry-on, and stormed toward the gate, firing one last venomous glare over her shoulder. "Now boarding Flight 82 to London," the intercom announced softly. Julian exhaled, silently hoping fate wouldn't seat them near each other. Slinging his backpack over one shoulder, a worn leather bag containing a laptop worth millions in intellectual property, he headed for the gate. The moment he stepped onto the aircraft, the energy shifted. The first-class cabin of the 787 felt like a private sanctuary, bathed in warm lighting and wrapped in supple leather. There were only 8 suites. Intimate, almost uncomfortably so. Julian checked his ticket. Seat 2A. Walking down the aisle, he nodded to a flight attendant, a tall woman with kind eyes named Noor. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Crowhurst," she said with a warm smile. "May I take your coat?" "I'll keep it, thanks," Julian replied. When he reached row 2, he stopped short. Seated directly across the narrow aisle was Rosalind Fairmont. She was already settled in, sipping a pre-departure scotch while flipping through a business magazine. The moment she noticed Julian standing beside her seat, her expression twisted, not just annoyed, but deeply offended. "You have got to be kidding me," she muttered, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Without a word, Julian lifted his bag into the overhead bin and took his seat. As he settled in, he could feel her glare drilling into his back, burning with a fury that had only just begun. The privacy divider between the seats was lowered, leaving the space open. Julian reached forward, his fingers hovering as he pressed the button to raise it. "Don't touch that," Rosalind snapped sharply. Julian froze, his hand mid-air. "Excuse me?" "I don't like the divider up during takeoff," she said stiffly. "It makes the cabin feel closed in." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The real reason was simpler and uglier. She wanted him in full view at all times. In her warped, prejudiced reasoning, she had already decided he was either dangerous or a thief. "And I'm curious," she continued, eyes narrowing. "How exactly did you manage to upgrade to this cabin? Did your parents donate their miles? Or did the airline give you some kind of charity seat to satisfy a diversity quota?" The cabin fell into an uncomfortable silence. The elderly couple in row 1 stared straight ahead, while a tech CEO seated across the aisle pretended to be deeply absorbed in his phone. No one spoke, but the tension pressed down like thick fog. Julian met her stare without blinking. "I bought the ticket," he said calmly. "Same way you did." "I highly doubt that," Rosalind scoffed, snapping her magazine page with unnecessary force. "Seats in this cabin cost $12,000. You don't look like you could afford the tax on a bus pass." "Ma'am," Julian replied quietly, his voice lowering, controlled but firm. "I just want to sleep." "Then go sleep back in row 40 where you belong," she hissed. At that exact moment, a flight attendant appeared at Julian's side with a warm towel draped neatly over her arm. "Mr. Crowhurst," she said pleasantly, "would you care for a glass of champagne before we push back?" "Just water, please," Julian replied. "And I'll have another scotch," Rosalind barked without looking up. "And Sarah, I want to speak with the purser. I have concerns about how this passenger manifest was vetted." For the briefest instant, Sarah's professional smile flickered. She had spent years in the air. She knew exactly what Rosalind was implying. "The manifest is cleared by both corporate and security, Miss Fairmont," she said evenly. "Is there a specific concern?" "The concern," Rosalind replied, lifting her glass and pointing it toward Julian, "is that I paid a premium for comfort and safety, and I do not feel safe sitting next to this." Julian's hands curled into tight fists in his lap. He inhaled slowly through his nose. "Don't engage," he reminded himself. "You're closing the deal of a lifetime tomorrow. Don't let this bigot sabotage it." "I assure you," Sarah said firmly, "Mr. Crowhurst is a valued customer." "We'll see," Rosalind muttered. A heavy thud echoed through the cabin as the doors sealed shut. The jet bridge began to pull away. There was no leaving now. For the next 7 hours, they were locked together inside a metal tube, hurtling across the Atlantic. Julian slipped on his headphones and queued up a classical cello concerto, letting the music drown her out. He closed his eyes, convinced the worst had passed. He assumed she'd sulk quietly and drink herself into silence. He was wrong. The alcohol only amplified her prejudice, blending into something volatile, an explosion waiting to happen before the wheels ever left the ground. The aircraft began to push back, the gentle tug of the tractor pulling the massive machine away from the gate. A cheerful safety animation flickered onto the personal screens, its bright tone wildly mismatched with the hostility simmering in the cabin. Julian kept his eyes shut, focusing on the deep resonance of the cello in his ears. He forced his thoughts toward London, toward the meeting that mattered. Tomorrow he would sit down with Stratify Labs, a fictional successor to the infamous firms of the past, to discuss acquiring his company, Veritas. He had built Veritas to identify and eliminate bias in hiring algorithms. The irony wasn't lost on him that the very prejudice his software fought against was now sitting 3 feet away, wrapped in a Chanel suit. Rosalind, however, was far from oblivious. The scotch hit her fast on an empty stomach, and she simmered with rage. To her, Julian's mere presence was an insult, a personal slight. The airline, in her mind, had degraded her status by letting riffraff into her sanctuary. She reached across the armrest and jabbed Julian hard in the shoulder. He ignored her. She struck him again, harder this time, her manicured nails digging into the fabric of his hoodie. Julian slowly pulled one ear cup away. "Yes, I saw you," she whispered, her words slightly slurred but dripping with malice. "I saw you in my bag when I went to the lavatory before we left the gate." "I haven't touched you or your bag," Julian replied, his patience unraveling like frayed rope. "I've been sitting right here the entire time." "Liar," she spat. "I know your type. You wait until everyone's asleep, and then you steal. I have sensitive corporate documents in that bag. If anything goes missing, I'll have an air marshal on you so fast your head will spin." "Ma'am, I don't care about your documents," Julian said tightly. "I have my own work." "Oh, I'm sure," she sneered. "What is it? Rap lyrics? Drug money?" The elderly man in row 1 finally turned around. His hands trembled with age, but his voice was firm. "Madam, that's enough. Leave the young man alone." "Mind your own business," Rosalind snapped. "You're probably senile." She turned back to Julian, eyes blazing. "I want you to move." "We're already pushing back," Julian said evenly. "I can't." "I don't care. Switch with someone in coach. I'm sure they'd love a first-class seat. Go, now." Julian replaced his headphones and said a single word. "No." That word was the match. Rosalind Fairmont was not a woman accustomed to refusal. She had people fired over incorrect coffee orders. No one, especially someone she deemed beneath her, had ever said no to her. She lunged forward and ripped the headphones off Julian's head. The cocoon of noise-canceling silence vanished, replaced by engine hum and a sharp gasp from a nearby passenger. "Don't you dare turn your back on me!" Rosalind shouted as she stood, swaying. The seatbelt sign glowed overhead. Sarah rushed down the aisle, bracing herself against the moving aircraft. "Miss Fairmont, sit down immediately. The plane is in motion." "I will not sit next to a thief," Rosalind screamed, now fully hysterical, playing to an audience she assumed was on her side. "He stole my headphones. He's trying to steal my bag." Julian remained perfectly still. He knew better. If he stood, raised his voice, or showed even a hint of anger, the story would change instantly and not in his favor. If he reacted the wrong way, he knew exactly how this would end. He would become the angry black man, and she would instantly transform into the shaken, innocent victim. Slowly and deliberately, Julian lifted his hands into view, palms open, making a point of showing they were empty. "These are my headphones," he said evenly. "They're either mine or the ones the airline provided. You switched them." Daniel Mercer Rosalind let out a shrill scream. "Check his bag," she shouted. "He probably has a gun in there." The word hung in the cabin like poison gas. Gun. In a post-9/11 world, that accusation wasn't just dangerous, it was catastrophic. "Miss Fairmont," Sarah warned sharply, her voice stripped of all practiced politeness, "sit down right now, or I will be forced to report you." "Report me?" Rosalind laughed, the sound sharp and unhinged. "I make more in a week than you make in a year, you glorified waitress. Get the pilot. Tell him to turn this plane around and remove this thug from my flight." Then she crossed a line no one expected. In a burst of performative rage, she grabbed the glass of water resting on her console and flung it straight into Julian's face. The icy liquid soaked his hoodie, pooled on the leather seat, and splashed across his laptop bag. The cabin fell into stunned silence. Julian didn't jump. He didn't shout. He simply reached up and wiped the water from his eye, slowly, deliberately. When he looked at Rosalind again, there was no anger in his expression, only a chilling, controlled calm. "You just made a very big mistake," he said quietly. Sarah immediately grabbed the handset mounted near the galley. She didn't call the purser. She punched in the emergency code for the flight deck. "Captain," she said, her voice shaking but steady, "we have a situation in first class, a physical assault." Captain Thomas Calder was still taxiing toward the runway. A former Air Force pilot who had flown combat missions, he had zero tolerance for chaos on his aircraft. He heard the strain in Sarah's voice. He caught the noise behind her words. Without hesitation, he keyed the radio. "This is Flight 82. We are aborting taxi and requesting immediate return to the gate. We have a security incident on board." "Copy, Flight 82. The controller replied, clearly surprised. "Do you require law enforcement?" Captain Calder glanced at his co-pilot and set the parking brake. The aircraft shuddered to a sudden stop, jolting everyone inside. "Affirmative," he said, jaw clenched. "Have them meet us at the jet bridge and tell them to bring handcuffs." Back in row 2, Rosalind smirked as she looked down at Julian, soaked and motionless. "Finally," she said, smoothing her skirt. "The pilot's coming to take out the trash." She had no idea the trash was about to take her out. The sensation of a plane turning around on the tarmac is unmistakable. It carries the weight of failure of massive machinery bowing to disruption. For the 300 passengers in economy, it sparked collective groans and muttered curses, missed connections, ruined schedules, crying children. But in first class, the air was different. Heavier, personal, suffocating. Captain Calder announced the return to the gate, citing a passenger disturbance. He offered no details, but none were needed in row 2. Rosalind Fairmont sat blotting her lipstick with a napkin, composed and confident, as if she hadn't just assaulted another passenger. In her mind, the story was already settled, and she was the hero. The water, she told herself, had been defensive. necessary. He was aggressive, she reassured herself. He stole my headphones. He threatened me. She pulled out her phone and began typing rapidly, messaging her personal attorney, a man who charged $800 an hour to make problems disappear. Edmund. Emergency on Flight 82. Being harassed by a belligerent passenger. Captain returning to gate to remove him. Might need a formal complaint against Delta for endangering me. I'll call when we land. She sent the message and smiled smugly. Julian hadn't moved. The water had soaked through his thick cotton hoodie and into his t-shirt, leaving him cold, sticky, and humiliated. But his focus wasn't on the discomfort. His mind was elsewhere, running calculations, assessing damage. At his feet sat the battered leather satchel Rosalind had fixated on. Inside was a customized laptop with an encrypted drive containing the source code for Veritas 2.0. If water had seeped through the seams, if it had reached the motherboard, the London demo worth $50 million would be dead before it began. He desperately wanted to check the bag. He needed to, but he knew that reaching for it now would trigger another scream, another accusation of a gun. So he stayed still, shivering slightly, as water dripped from the tip of his nose, waiting for what was coming. "I hope you're happy," Rosalind sneered as the plane rolled to a final stop at the gate. "You've inconvenienced everyone. All because you couldn't stay in the back where you belong." The man seated across the aisle in 3A Tech CEO, named Daniel Mercer, leaned forward. He'd noticed Julian's sneakers earlier, but hadn't placed him until now. "Lady, will you shut the hell up?" he snapped. "You're the one who threw the water." Rosalind spun toward him. "Excuse me? I am the victim here. I'm a woman traveling alone. He was menacing me." "Menacing you?" Daniel shot back, holding up his phone. He was sitting there listening to Kai Lin, and for the record, I've been recording audio since you started screaming about the headphones. For just a moment, her face drained of color. Then she recovered. "Recording without consent is illegal," she snapped. "I'll sue you to the sound of the seatbelt chime." The familiar ding of the seatbelt sign switching off rang through the cabin like a boxing bell, signaling the next round. Moments later, the aircraft door swung open, and a rush of cool jet bridge air flooded inside, colliding with the stale, recycled cabin atmosphere. Sarah stood just inside the doorway, hands clasped tightly in front of her. She looked shaken. In 20 years of flying, she had seen plenty of difficult passengers, but the sheer cruelty on display today was something else entirely. She lifted her gaze as the captain stepped out of the cockpit. Captain Thomas Calder was not a man who wasted words. He stood 6'2", his temples streaked with gray, his posture rigid with the confidence of someone who had landed fighter jets on pitching aircraft carriers. He adjusted his hat once, then walked into first class. The silence was absolute. "Who is the passenger in question?" Calder asked, his voice low, steady, and unmistakably authoritative. Rosalind immediately unbuckled her seatbelt and rose to her feet, smoothing her skirt as she stood. Her expression shifted into a polished boardroom smile equal parts charm and superiority. She stepped into the aisle, deliberately blocking his path to Julian. "Captain, thank you for returning," she said smoothly. "I'm Rosalind Fairmont, Diamond Medallion member." She extended a manicured finger toward Julian, who remained seated. "This young man has been harassing me since the lounge. He stole my property, and when I confronted him, he became aggressive. I was forced to defend myself with water. I want him removed and arrested." Calder didn't respond right away. He looked at Rosalind. Then his eyes shifted to the water still dripping from Julian's face. He took in the puddle soaking into the expensive leather seat. Finally, he turned to Sarah. "Sarah," he said calmly, ignoring Rosalind entirely. "What happened?" "Excuse me," Rosalind snapped. I'm speaking to you. Don't ask the help. Ask the victim. Calder turned his head slowly toward her. His eyes hardened into steel. "Ma'am," he said evenly, "you are currently interfering with a flight crew member. That is a federal offense. You will remain silent until I address you." Rosalind's mouth snapped shut, more from shock than compliance. Sarah swallowed and began again. "Miss Fairmont has been verbally abusive to Mr. Crowhurst since boarding," she said, her voice trembling but clear. She accused him of theft. He did not engage. She then stood up while the aircraft was moving, screamed at him, and threw a glass of water in his face. Mr. Crowhurst has not raised his voice or said a word. "Lies," Rosalind hissed. "She's covering for him, probably because he—" "That's enough," Calder cut in sharply. He turned to the rest of the cabin. "Did anyone else witness this?" The elderly man in row 1 raised his hand. "I saw everything, Captain. That woman is unhinged. The young man did nothing. She assaulted him." Across the aisle, Daniel Mercer lifted his phone. "I have audio, Captain. She repeatedly calls him a thief and a thug." Then you hear the splash. Calder nodded once. Then he looked directly at Julian. "Son," he asked, "are you all right?" Julian finally lifted his head. His eyes were red, but his voice remained steady. "I'm wet, Captain, and I'm worried about my laptop. But physically, I'm fine." "Would you like to press charges?" Calder asked. Julian glanced at Rosalind. She stared back at him with raw hatred, still convinced she could bully her way out. "Yes," Julian said quietly. "Good," Calder replied. He gestured toward the open door. 2 officers from the Port Authority Police Department stepped onto the plane, their utility belts heavy, their expressions grim. Rosalind exhaled with relief. "Finally," she said smugly. "Officers, take him. And be careful. I think he has a weapon in his bag." Sergeant Klein glanced at the captain. Calder pointed not at Julian, but at Rosalind. "Remove the passenger in seat 2B, he said firmly. "Assault and battery, interference with a flight crew, creating a disturbance." In that instant, Rosalind Fairmont felt something she had never experienced in her 52 years, a complete collapse of reality. "What?" she laughed, high and brittle. "Captain, you're mistaken. He's the problem. Look at him. He's wearing a hoodie." Sergeant Klein stepped forward, filling the aisle. "Ma'am, please step out and turn around." "Don't touch me," Rosalind shouted, backing into the galley wall. "Do you know who I am? I'm the Senior Vice President of Apex Global Logistics. I have the police commissioner on speed dial. Touch me, and I'll have your badges." "Ma'am," Klein said evenly, reaching for his cuffs, "this is your final warning." The metallic click echoed like a gunshot. "I'm not going anywhere," Rosalind screamed, lunging toward her seat, perhaps for her phone, perhaps for something worse. The officers moved instantly. They seized her arms. "Get off me! Rape! Police brutality!" she shrieked, thrashing violently. She kicked backward, her heel striking the second officer's leg. "That's assaulting an officer," Klein grunted as he spun her around and forced her hands behind her back. The cuffs snapped shut. Rosalind gasped. The cold steel around her wrists felt unreal. This wasn't supposed to happen to people like her. This was for criminals, for other people. "You're making a mistake," she hissed as they marched her toward the door. "I will ruin you. I'll buy this airline and fire every last one of you." She twisted as they passed row 2. Julian sat quietly, dabbing his face with a towel Sarah had given him. "You did this," Rosalind spat. "You filthy little—" "Keep moving," Klein barked, shoving her forward. She was dragged off the plane and onto the jet bridge, where a small crowd of terminal onlookers had already begun to gather. A sound rippled from the back of the aircraft. It started in economy, where word had spread row by row, then rolled forward like a wave. Applause. not the polite, restrained kind no golf claps. This was loud, raw approval. People were cheering. Someone yelled, "Bye, Karen!" Rosalind's face flushed a blotchy shade of purple as she was shoved into the back seat of a squad car parked on the tarmac. Red and blue lights strobed against the white curve of the fuselage. Inside the plane, silence settled again, but it felt different now. Lighter. The tension that had been choking the cabin finally snapped. Captain Calder turned toward Julian. "Mr. Crowhurst, on behalf of the airline, I want to apologize. What happened was completely unacceptable." "Thank you, Captain," Julian replied, already unzipping his bag. His hands trembled as the adrenaline finally caught up with him. "We'll need to take a statement for the police report," Calder continued. "Normally, that would require deplaning at the station." Julian froze. "Captain, I have to be in London in the morning. I have a meeting at 9 a.m. If I get off this plane, I miss it." Calder studied him for a moment and saw the panic wasn't performative. This wasn't a vacation itinerary. It mattered. "Hold on," the captain said. He stepped out onto the jet bridge and spoke quietly with the police sergeant. They gestured toward the aircraft, then Calder tapped his watch. After a beat, the sergeant nodded, clearly reluctant. Calder returned. "All right, Sergeant Klein will take a preliminary statement here. You'll sign it, we depart, and you can follow up with London authorities or the FBI after landing. But we need to move. This delay has already burned 30 minutes of fuel." "Thank you," Julian exhaled. "Thank you so much." As the officer scribbled notes documenting the insults, the threats, the water, Julian discreetly opened his laptop case. He lifted the MacBook out. The aluminum shell was damp. Droplets clung to the keyboard cover. He held his breath and pressed the power button. Nothing. He tried again. The screen stayed black. His heart slammed against his ribs. Veritas wasn't backed up to the cloud. The latest version was too valuable, too sensitive to risk exposure. Everything was stored locally. If the drive was fried. "Is everything okay?" Sarah asked, noticing his pale expression. "I don't know," Julian whispered. The 7-hour flight to London became a slow torture for Julian Crowhurst. While the rest of first class slept helped, along by apology wine and extra amenity kits, Julian sat hunched over his tray table, angling the air nozzle to dry out the laptop's ports. Sleep was impossible. The humiliation replayed in his mind, but worse was the looming loss of his life's work. Apex Global Logistics, Rosalind Fairmont. He etched both names into memory. Midway across the Atlantic, the Wi-Fi came online. Julian connected his phone and immediately froze. His notifications were exploding. Somehow, the video was already everywhere. Daniel Mercer, the tech CEO from Row 3 with millions of followers on X, had posted the clip. "Just watch this absolute monster attack a kid in first class on Delta 109 to London. Racism is alive and well, folks. Kudos to the captain for dragging her off. Delta scores a rare Karen Justice win." The video had racked up 2.4 million views in 4 hours. Julian scrolled through the comments. "Who is she? That poor kid didn't even flinch. I hope she rots in jail." Then came a verified reply from a well-known tech journalist. "Wait, I recognize that hoodie. Is that Julian Crowhurst, the founder of Veritas? I interviewed him at TechCrunch Disrupt last year. Is she attacking one of the brightest minds in AI?" The internet did what it does best. By the time the plane began descending into Heathrow, Rosalind Fairmont had been fully doxxed. Her LinkedIn was under siege. Apex Global Logistics' stock ticker was trending, and not favorably. Julian barely noticed. All he cared about was the laptop. He tried powering it on one last time. As the plane slipped through the clouds over London, the Apple logo flickered to life. It stayed visible for 3 seconds. Then the screen fractured into green and purple static before going dark again. Julian closed his eyes and buried his face in his hands. The drive controller was likely shorted. The data might be recoverable, but not by morning. No demo, no proof of concept, no leverage. He was walking into a room full of Stratify Lab sharks with nothing but a soaked hoodie and a story about a racist woman on a plane. The aircraft touched down. As Julian gathered his things, Daniel Mercer stood and extended a hand. "Hey," Daniel said. "I saw the news. Didn't realize who you were until the tweets. Justice Holloway, CEO of Nebula Systems." Julian shook his hand weakly. "Julian Crowhurst." "I saw you trying to boot your rig," Daniel said, glancing at the lifeless laptop. "Is it dead?" "Yeah," Julian said hollowly. "And I've got a pitch meeting in 2 hours." Daniel winced. "That's brutal. Who with?" "Stratify Labs." Daniel whistled. "That's the Dragon's Den. Listen, if you need a character witness or a backup machine—" "Backup won't help," Julian interrupted. "The drive's encrypted. No key, no data." "Fair," Daniel said. "Still, thanks for letting me post the video. Might help with the lawsuit." "Lawsuit?" Daniel let out a dry laugh. "Kid, by the time you land, that woman won't just be sued. She's going to be obliterated." Julian stepped off the plane, his bag hanging heavy at his sideless luggage now. More coffin for everything he'd built. He drifted through customs on autopilot, barely registering the questions, the stamps, the fluorescent lights. In the arrivals hall, a driver stood waiting, holding a placard that read, "Crowhurst." Julian slid into the back seat of a black Rolls-Royce, the door closing with a muted thud. "Where to, sir?" the driver asked. "The Shard," Julian replied. "Cambridge Analytica headquarters. And can we stop at an electronics store first?" "Of course. What do you need?" "A screwdriver." The driver glanced at him in the mirror. "A screwdriver, sir?" "Yes," Julian said quietly. "I need to take a hard drive apart." Back in New York, Rosalind Fairmont sat seething inside a holding cell at Queens County Central Booking. Her phone, belt, and shoelaces had been confiscated. The room reeked of bleach and stale urine. She paced like a caged animal, fury radiating off her. She had already burned her single phone call screaming at her husband, demanding he wake Edmund Rourke Whitlow immediately. Eventually, a guard approached the bars. "Fairmont," he grunted, "your lawyer's here. Bail's been posted." "About time," she snapped. "I want the names of everyone involved in this arrest." She marched into the processing area, straightening her rumpled suit, then froze. Edmund Rourke Whitlow stood waiting, but the shark was gone. His face was pale. His eyes looked hollow, like he'd seen something catastrophic. "Edmund," Rosalind said briskly. "Get the car. We're suing the airline immediately, and I want that boy's name." Edmund raised a hand. "Crowhurst, stop." She blinked. "Excuse me?" "You haven't seen the news," he said quietly, lifting his iPad. The headline filled the screen. "Executive arrested after racist mid-air attack on teen tech prodigy." Rosalind scoffed. "So? I'll explain it to them. It was a misunderstanding." "There's nothing to explain," Edmund said, his voice shaking. "The board called me 10 minutes ago. They watched the video." "So?" "They held an emergency vote," he continued. "You're terminated, effective immediately, for cause, no severance, no stock options." The noise of the station seemed to fade around her. "Fired?" she whispered. Edmund didn't stop. "And there's more. The boy you assaulted, Julian Crowhurst Apex, was already in talks to acquire his software next quarter. Logistics optimization." He swallowed. The deal was worth $300 million. Rosalind's knees buckled. She collapsed onto the filthy bench in the waiting area, staring at nothing. "You didn't just attack a teenager," Edmund said softly. "You destroyed the company's future." But none of that fallout helped Julian in London. He stood alone in an elevator rising through the spine of the shard, a screwdriver heavy in his pocket, a dead laptop clutched in his hand. The doors opened onto the 72nd floor. The conference room offered a panoramic view of London billions of pounds worth of skyline. The Thames snaked through the city like a silver artery, sunlight flashing off glass towers. Inside the room, the mood was cold, surgical. The partners of Stratify Labs sat along a long mahogany table. At the head sat Sir Malcolm Everleigh Knighted, formidable, old school, famous for dismantling young founders with surgical efficiency. To his right was Helena Joe, a venture capitalist with razor focus and zero patience for hand-waving. Julian Crowhurst stood at the front, exhausted. His clothes were dry but creased. He still wore the same sneakers from the flight. On the table lay the remains of his MacBook Pro. He'd tried in the lobby restroom to extract the drive, mounting it externally with a cable he bought at the airport. It hadn't worked. Water damage had fried the logic board, corrupting the encryption controller. Veritas was entombed inside silicon and aluminum. "Mr. Crowhurst," Sir Malcolm said, checking his watch. "You've traveled far, but my time is valuable. You promised a real-time demonstration of your bias detection algorithm." He gestured toward the laptop. "All I see is broken hardware." "I apologize, Sir Malcolm," Julian said evenly, adrenaline surging. "As explained, there was an incident on my flight. My equipment was destroyed." "We are not an insurance firm," Helena Joe said flatly. "We are investors. Without a demo, we cannot validate your valuation." She closed her notebook. "Perhaps we should reconvene next month, assuming you can afford another ticket." It was over. They were ready to leave. Cold sweat crept down Julian's spine. If this meeting ended now, the deal died. Apex had already withdrawn. He didn't know why yet, and without this funding, his servers wouldn't survive the quarter. Julian turned to the whiteboard behind him, then to the markers. "I can't show you compiled code," he said, his voice strengthening, "but I wrote every line of Veritas. I don't need a laptop to explain how it works." Sir Malcolm paused, hand resting on his notebook. He studied Julian closely, saw the desperation, yes, but also something else. Fire. "Go on," Sir Malcolm said. Julian grabbed a black marker, uncapping it with his teeth. He began to write. Not boxes, not vague arrows. Code, dense Python logic, low-level C structures, memory management flows. He mapped the neural network's decision tree in real time, explaining the heuristic weighting system he'd invented to isolate racial and gender bias inside hiring datasets, line by line, from first principles. The room fell silent again, but this time it was the sound of attention. "Most AI systems hunt for patterns," Julian explained as he sketched a multidimensional array across the board. "But patterns are just recycled history. And when history is biased, the machine learns that bias." He drew a sharp line beneath the diagram. Veritas doesn't chase patterns. It looks for anomalies in decision velocity. It measures how long an algorithm hesitates before rejecting a candidate based on things like a zip code or a name. He began writing equations beneath the diagram, laying out the mathematical proof behind his velocity variance theory. For 20 straight minutes, the marker squeaked rhythmically against the whiteboard. Julian Crowhurst didn't pause. He filled the wall edge to edge, his explanation unfolding like a symphony of logic. Sweat beaded at his temples. His hand cramped. Still, he kept going until the final bracket snapped shut. Only then did he turn around, marker still in hand. The room was utterly silent. Helena Joe was leaning forward in her chair, eyes scanning the board, mentally running the equations. "The recursive loop in the third node," she said, pointing. "It prevents the echo chamber effect." "Exactly," Julian replied. "It forces the system to challenge its own assumptions before finalizing an outcome. Sir Malcolm slowly closed his notebook. He studied the wall, then shifted his gaze to Julian. "I've seen thousands of pitch decks," Sir Malcolm said quietly. "Flash drives, polished demos, 3D projections." He paused. "I have never seen a founder write the kernel of his own operating system from memory on a wall." He stood and walked toward the window, looking out over London. "Tell me something, Mr. Crowhurst. That incident on the plane, the one that destroyed your laptop, was it simply a spilled drink?" Julian hesitated. "Yes, sir. Another passenger poured water on it." "An accident?" Julian's jaw tightened. He hadn't wanted sympathy. "No, sir, it wasn't." Sir Malcolm turned back and picked up a remote. "We track markets," he said, dropping the honorific, "but we also track the news." He clicked the remote. The large screen flickered to life, displaying a BBC broadcast. The headline read, "Viral Disgrace. Executive Fired After Racist Mid-Air Tirade." The footage rolled insults, the splash of water, the eruption of applause as Rosalind was dragged away. Julian watched, stunned. He hadn't seen the video before. He saw himself on screen silent, composed, absorbing the abuse without breaking. "This went live while you were still in the air," Helena Jo said softly. "Rosalind Fairmont was terminated by Apex hours later. Their stock dropped 4% this morning." Sir Malcolm regarded Julian differently now, not as a founder, but as a man. "You showed extraordinary restraint," he said. "Anyone who can stay composed under public humiliation can handle the pressure of a billion-dollar IPO." He returned to his seat. He didn't look at the whiteboard again. He looked only at Julian. "You asked for a $50 million valuation," Sir Malcolm began. Julian's heart sank. "It's too low," Sir Malcolm interrupted. "This incident has made you the most visible founder in the world. By tomorrow morning, everyone will want a stake in Veritas." He slid a document across the table. "We're valuing the company at $75 million. We want 20% equity, and we will personally finance the lawsuit against Miss Fairmont." Julian stared at the paper. His hand, steady while writing complex code, began to tremble. "Deal," he whispered. Sir Malcolm extended his hand. "Welcome to the big leagues, son. Now let's get you a new laptop and perhaps a better hoodie." 6 months after Flight 82 returned to the gate at JFK, time seemed frozen inside the civil courtroom of the Southern District of New York. The air smelled of old wood polish, floor wax, and recycled bureaucracy, a place where fortunes were decided and reputations quietly buried. The gallery was packed. Reporters, law students, onlookers drawn by a case that had dominated headlines and ignited cultural debate. Crowhurst versus Fairmont. Julian Crowhurst sat at the plaintiff's table. To a casual observer, he barely resembled the hoodie-clad young man from the viral video. He wore a navy bespoke suit, tailored on Savile Row, fitted with surgical precision. His posture was relaxed but assured, the stance of someone accustomed to negotiating 8-figure deals behind closed doors. Beside him sat his attorney, Ms. Blackwell, known in legal circles simply as the Viper. She tapped her pen against a thick case file, radiating quiet, predatory confidence. Across the aisle sat a void of despair. Rosalind Fairmont occupied the defense table alone, accompanied only by a court-appointed representative who looked eager for the ordeal to end. Stratify Labs. The transformation was jarring. The armor she'd worn for decades, Chanel suits, immaculate hair, that familiar sneer was gone. She wore a cheap, ill-fitting gray suit from a department store she once wouldn't have entered. Her hair was pulled into a brittle knot, exposing a face carved by exhaustion and bitterness. She looked smaller, hollow. The last 6 months had dismantled her life piece by piece, not just the lawsuit, the erasure of her identity. She closed her eyes, trying to shut out the whispers from the gallery, but memory was louder. She saw the emergency board meeting at Apex Global Logistics. 20 years of colleagues refusing to meet her gaze. And that was only the beginning. She remembered the security guard escorting her out of the building, a cardboard box cradled in her arms, while junior analysts filmed her downfall on their phones without shame. She remembered the suffocating quiet of her Hamptons home, right before she lost it. Her husband, humiliated by the pariah status she had dragged onto their family name, hadn't simply filed for divorce. He had annihilated her in court. Her social circle evaporated overnight. Country club privileges revoked. Charity galas rescinded their invitations. Doors she once walked through effortlessly were now slammed shut. She had become untouchable, radioactive. "All rise!" the bailiff thundered, his voice slicing through Rosalind's spiral. The Honorable Justice Holloway entered with purpose. She was a stern, no-nonsense woman whose eyes cut through performance and pretense alike. Taking her seat, she adjusted her glasses and studied both tables in silence. "We are here to finalize the settlement agreement in Crowhurst versus Fairmont," Justice Holloway said, her voice echoing through the courtroom. "Miss Fairmont, you have agreed to the terms submitted by the plaintiff." Rosalind stood. Her legs felt unsteady, as if they might collapse beneath her. She gripped the edge of the table for balance. I had no choice, Your Honor," she said weakly. "I've been advised that proceeding to trial would result in significantly harsher penalties. I am financially ruined." "You are not bankrupt yet," the judge corrected crisply, flipping through the file. "But based on these terms, your financial reality is about to change considerably." Justice Holloway began reading the settlement aloud. To Rosalind, it didn't sound like justice. It sounded like a eulogy. "First," the judge said, "the defendant is ordered to pay $2.5 million in compensatory and punitive damages for emotional distress, defamation, and the destruction of proprietary intellectual property." Rosalind's breath caught. "To satisfy this judgment, the court orders the immediate liquidation of the defendant's remaining assets, including the sale of her Upper East Side apartment and the forfeiture of her retirement accounts." She flinched. That apartment was the last thing she had left, her refuge. And now it belonged symbolically and legally to the boy in the hoodie. "Second," Justice Holloway continued, "Miss Fairmont will record a public apology video. This video will be unscripted, approved by plaintiff's counsel, and posted permanently to all social media platforms. It must remain pinned to the top of her profiles for no fewer than 5 years." A low murmur of approval rolled through the gallery. For a woman who had lived on reputation and pride, this punishment cut deeper than any fine. "And third," the judge said, peering over her glasses, "restorative justice. You are hereby ordered to complete 500 hours of community service, not at a comfortable nonprofit, but at the Bronx Youth Coding Initiative, founded by Mr. Crowhurst." She paused. "You will be cleaning facilities and serving meals to the very community you insulted." Tears burned at Rosalind's eyes, not of remorse, but of rage, humiliation, and helpless grief. "I signed it," she whispered. "It's done." "Very well," Justice Holloway said, turning to the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Crowhurst, do you wish to make a statement before judgment is entered?" Julian Crowhurst rose. The room fell completely silent. Even the stenographer stopped typing. Julian buttoned his jacket with deliberate calm and turned to face Rosalind. He wasn't angry. That was what shattered her. She understood fury. She could survive screaming. But what he offered her instead was something far worse quiet, devastating pity. He looked at her like an artifact from another era, a fossil that hadn't realized extinction had already come. "Miss Fairmont," Julian began, his voice steady and resonant, filling the courtroom without effort. "You asked me if I belonged in first class. You told me to go back to row 40. Rosalind stared at the floor, trembling. You told me to go back to where I fit in, he continued. He paused. I want you to know that because of what you did, Veritas has now launched in 30 countries. We're removing bias from hiring systems worldwide. We're making sure intelligence is recognized regardless of zip code, and that people who look like me do get into the rooms where they belong. The weight of his success settled over the courtroom. He wasn't a lucky kid. He was momentum. And about the money, Julian said, turning slightly toward the press. I know that $2.5 million represents everything you have left. I know it reflects your entire life's work. He inhaled once. I'm not keeping any of it. A collective gasp swept the room. Miss Blackwell allowed herself a small, knowing smile. I'm donating the full settlement, Julian continued, to establish a new grant program. It will be called the Fairmont Scholarship Fund. Rosalind's head snapped up, eyes wide. My name? Yes, Julian said. For the first time, a sharp, diamond-hard smile touched his lips. But not for you. He met her gaze one final time. The fund will provide full scholarships to young minority students from low-income neighborhoods to attend flight school. It will train the next generation of black pilots. The irony hit the courtroom like a physical shock wave. So, Julian finished calmly, every time you look up and see a plane in the sky, Miss Fairmont, I want you to remember your money helped put someone like me in the cockpit. And with that, the past finally let go. You tried to kick me off the plane, Julian finished calmly. Now you're going to help us fly them. For a heartbeat, the courtroom was frozen in stunned silence. Then it exploded. This wasn't polite applause. It was thunder. Cheers ripped through the gallery as reporters hammered at their keyboards, capturing every second. Justice Holloway banged her gavel repeatedly, though even she couldn't fully suppress the faint, satisfied curve at the corner of her mouth. Rosalind Fairmont buried her face in her hands and sobbed. She wasn't crying for mercy. She was crying because at last she understood the magnitude of her loss. Julian hadn't merely defeated her, he had transformed her most prized possession, her elite name, into a permanent symbol of the diversity she had spent her life rejecting. 10 minutes later, Julian stepped through the heavy bronze doors of the courthouse and into the bright New York afternoon. The air felt different, lighter. It tasted like closure. Paparazzi clustered at the base of the steps, camera flashes popping like fireworks, voices shouting questions from every direction. Julian ignored them. He slipped on a pair of dark aviator sunglasses and kept walking. A sleek black Mercedes pulled up to the curb. The window rolled down, revealing Daniel Mercer, the tech CEO from Seat 3A, the man whose recording had started everything. Need a lift to the airport? Daniel called out with a grin. I hear the first-class lounge is great, as long as the company behaves this time. Julian laughed, a real unguarded sound that cut through his newly polished executive exterior. He jogged down the steps and opened the door. Yeah, he said. Let's go. Daniel eased the car into traffic. Suit this time? Julian glanced out the window at the skyline, at the clouds drifting high above the city, where jets carved white lines through blue sky. No, he said softly, it never did. And that's how a single cup of water ended one career and sparked a movement. Rosalind Fairmont believed she could intimidate Julian Crowhurst into shrinking himself. What she forgot was the most basic law of physics. For every action, there is an equal and opposite reaction. She tried to wash him away. Instead, she helped him rise. Julian didn't just win a lawsuit, he rewrote the story, turning an act of hatred into a scholarship of hope. It's a reminder to never judge a book by its cover or a passenger by their hoodie. You never really know who you're sitting next to. It just might be the person holding your future in their hands. If you enjoyed this story of karma and justice coming full circle, smash that like button. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more stories like this. Subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a new upload. Have you ever witnessed first-class drama in real life? Tell me your story in the comments below. I read every single one. Thanks for watching and fly safe.